I have done writing and speaking. As Michelle said, I'm also finishing up my doctoral degree. I'm doing the Doctor of Educational Ministry at Columbia Theological Seminary. I am a queer cis woman, and we'll get into that as we talk more, but that's a little bit just about my, social location, where I come from. I love youth. I love talking with parents. And I, love talking about justice and what we're talking about today. So this is my particular area of study is with LGBTQIA plus youth. So I'm excited to hear your questions that you'll bring.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And also to kind of add to that, Sarah and I kind of decided we'll put some resources in the chat. Sarah will have some of those things. But we really wanted to just kind of introduce ourselves, give a little bit of a story, and then open it up for questions. I mean, I think around this, the title is, around questions. So we figured that we would make this as communal as possible. So my name is Bruce Reyes-Chow. I use he, him pronouns and am, I don't even know how to introduce myself these days. I've been ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA since 1995. So my ordiversary, the dorkiest thing we do, as Gorgie is coming up at the end of this month. I have served all kinds of congregations. I come out of a historically Filipino congregation in Stockton, California, that was, open and affirming, more light without being any of those things before I even knew what that really was. So I grew up in a pretty, the kind of mainline experience we hope to provide for most of our folks. They work a little better than Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but it was a community that at that point was considered a progressive congregation in Stockton Presbytery. My own, what I'm doing these days is I pastor churches, but I haven't been pastoring now for about 6 months. I was hospitalized with COVID about a year ago. Some of you remember all of that time, and one of those functional long haulers these days. So I really have tapered back traveling and speaking and all those kind of things. So currently in San Jose, California, and doing a lot of writing. And I'm an empty nester for the second year, 3 children who are now all adults. So Sarah, why don't you share a little story, then I'll share a little story, and then we'll hopefully open up for questions. The one thing I would say is, I don't know if there's been any pre-warning for other workshops, but I think today in particular, it'll be important to know that this is recorded, to another reminder that so what you share about if you have young people in your world, to just remember. I've been in some events where it's recorded and they'll share things that as if we were just sitting in a room among friends.
Thank you.
And that is not, for this one, I think in particular, we want to remind ourselves about that. I know my children don't want me just sharing everything and having it recorded.
Yeah.
So.
And maybe don't share names and as we ask questions.
That's great. Yeah, that's good. Good. Okay. I'll turn it back over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Bruce. Thank you for that note too. So as I share stories with y'all, I am gonna do that thing where I don't share names. So I'm glad that Bruce pulled that out. And also, that's one of these pieces, especially in working with queer teenagers, where naming is part of these stories too. So there's a lot of stories that I can tell about youth that I have encountered. So I'm just going to tell y'all a couple brief ones. One is when I was a youth worker and serving in church, I thought that I was doing the exact thing, and I think it's a good practice, is putting pronouns on the paperwork. And I knew that that would start a conversation with parents. And I could hear people chatting about it in the room. Why are there pronouns? Why are there pronouns? And I had a youth put they, them on the pronoun blank. And then when I talked with that youth later on, and I'm shortcutting this story for our time, but when I talked with that youth later on, I met with them in a public place, and their mom came along, and I said, hey, so just want to talk with you about what pronouns work for you, and tell me a little bit about where you are as you're, exploring your identity as a teenager. And they said, yeah, I'm, non-binary. My mom knows, other people don't know, right? And I said, well, how do you want me to share this with the youth group? And they were like, don't do that. I said, okay. And I said, do you want me to tell the other leaders privately? We meet regularly. No, don't do that. And they said, I have a great group of friends and I feel very comfortable with my support group. I said, you feel supported? Yes, we walked through that. I said, do you feel safe at school? Yes, we walked through that. And they said, I have a name that the church knows me by this name, and I'm going to keep that until I graduate. And then I'm going to explore that. And I just thought that's a really beautiful point of compassion for the people that nurtured that youth, and then also moving into what that next phase of life is. Now, some youth, talk about changing names while they're teenagers, and that can be hard switch for a congregation. But it's also, I think, our responsibility as youth workers and those that love and nurture youth to help people walk alongside them in that journey. So that youth and I continued talking many, many months down the road. And some of the things I did was, were, there are these wonderful pens that Morelight had made, and I had stashed some they thems and some non-binary pens for this youth when I went to, I think it was APSI, and I handed it to them and I said, hey, I just snagged a couple of these, and they just lit up, right? So we had this practice of, or I noticed this repetitive instance of when I would say something that honored their pronouns and who they are as a person in the fullness of their being, they would light up, right? And so that's what we're looking for, I think, is them lighting up. And that difference, that subtle change you can see when a youth feels supported in their fullness and that they can kind of exhale, if that makes sense. So thanks, Michelle. So this is one of those where I messed up along the way. There are things that I made mistakes in these conversations with youth. I do it all the time. But I noticed in that particular instance when I messed up with this youth for this, in this particular example, I was accountable and just met with them, talked with them about it, told them where I messed up, and then I followed their lead. So that's one thing I wanted to share with y'all, is following the lead and listening to that youth. Another thing I'll just share briefly, a story that I was thinking about as we were preparing for this, is signaling. I talk about that in my academic work, but it's actually super simple in real life, right? So I have my Protect Queer Kids shirt on today. It's a wonderful company and an artist who makes, a queer artist who makes this gear. And I have a couple of shirts that I wear in rotation. And I was at Montreat this summer and I was serving as the community life coordinator. And so that meant I was standing in the road between the youth and the cars. It's a very important position. And people would cross every day and I would tell them to have a good day and make good choices, as you do. And I had this youth come past me several times. And then about the end of the week, they handed me candy. And I was like, ooh, free candy, love that. And then as they were walking back and forth to small group, I was wearing, I believe, my Protect Trans Kids shirt. And they said, can I stop and take a picture with you? Never met this youth, don't know them. But they were, I don't know their full story. But I do know that in that moment, I was just wearing a shirt and standing in the street, and they asked to take a photo. And so they felt seen, I felt seen. And it was a signal that I was a person they could stand with, even just for that moment. So those are a couple of things I just wanted to get our conversation started with, listening, signaling, and following the lead of the youth. Bruce.
Great, thank you. Let's see. So I could speak on this from a variety of spaces. So as a pastor, have pastored multiple types of congregation sizes, kind of always tended towards the more progressive side of our denomination, as well as, in recent years, I really won't serve anywhere that isn't affirming. I also, just so you know, I'm on the board of More Light Presbyterians. So if you want to say good things about them, feel free. But if you, want to talk smack about MLP, put that in the chat because that won't be recorded. In any case, but I'm going to speak to just as a parent, 3 children. I will not use their names, but I think everybody knows them. They've kind of grown up in the church. We joke with the only pull their dad has in our denomination is possibly giving them up to be on Montreat planning teams. So all 3 of them have been on Montreat youth planning teams. They're Californians, which Montreat is always eager to get. And so our youngest just was on planning team last summer after COVID delay. So now they're all looking for summer staff and small group leaders and all of that. So this denomination, throughout its geography, has a rich and deep place in our lives and raising my children, and we have intentionally surrounded them with people who have just simply loved them in our denomination, our churches, our communities, schools, all of that. Because I think for parenting, we hope that a lot of it is what we do, but I think most of it is by who we surround them with and places that we trust to help raise and nurture our children. And so we've been very intentional about where we do that with our 3 children. So let me talk as a parent. So I have a almost 26-year-old, a 21-year-old, and a 19-year-old. Our oldest identifies as non-binary, gender fluid. Our middle child identifies as queer, uses she, they. Our youngest, not sure what our youngest identifies as. On our family Zoom, we all have our pronouns because that's what we do. So she's still she, her on hers. So every story is different, and I think our hope often in not just the church but anywhere is we have a way that we do this, and that we can kind of translate that and lay that upon every other place. I think most of parenting a young person who is LGBTQIA and trying to figure out how to express that and talk about that, and parents trying to figure out how to respond, it's excruciatingly tiring to do, because if you've ever been asked to be nuanced and understand complexity and your own responses and emotions, this is probably as complex as it'll get, depending on what kind of place you've been before. So I grew up in a place where we were pretty sure that any coming out stories from any of our children, they would know that it would be fine. But even our oldest, when our oldest kind of let us know, we really tried not to be like, yeah, we know, because we wanted to honor the in some way the ritual of them letting us know this is the identity with which they are moving through the world. And so, our responses were very much, there was no, we love you, but, or there was no, it was just, tears, embraces, love, and really being, no reaction that was going to signal any kind of disappointment or, again, we love you, but, and I think that is really important. So parents needing to really almost pre-think about those kinds of things, because I think those immediate reactions can create a lot of harm and trauma in an initial kind of reaction. That said, if those reactions come out and they're regretted, I think lament and apology and healing and repair are always possible and important to do. So, but our oldest identifies as non-binary, uses they them pronouns, and I'll just tell a little bit about. So in that way, we asked some of the same questions that Sarah did, right? How do you want us to move through the world with this? What do you want us to do with family? All those kinds of things, and very much so. Our oldest was like, yeah, it's cool. Like just roll with it. Like, and I think that is one of those things that well-intentioned, open and affirming, progressive people, I think our first inclination was to interact a lot, and personalities, and to use this and that person as our personal kind of learning center, and then we want to we want to protect and fix immediately, and feel like there's a concrete thing that we can do. And what we've learned over all this time is, so the way that I did that, I'll say that my first thing was, our oldest kind of said, well, these are the pronouns I'm using, and at that stage, this was a very clear decision. I'm only using they them pronouns. There was name conversation. So my first two, like, let's fix this and let's act immediately, was, within a week, I'm like, well, do we want to do a reaffirmation of baptism and use a different name? And they're like, oh my God, Dad, seriously? Like, okay, slow
Right.
down. And then the other one was, I sent a note out to my entire family, because generationally, there's a great number of our family that I had no problem, I knew would not have any problems or issues. Others weren't so sure, and basically sent a protective parent bear note that said, unless your words are encouraging, you do not feel it for you to say anything.
Mm.
So, and that was a proactive kind of not knowing what that would happen. So, again, I think there is some action that was warranted in a very parenting way, and in other times, I just wanted to react and kind of fix things, and make things as comfortable as possible as soon as possible. I think at the end of the day, our middle kid identified as queer, and there's never been any kind of coming out or anything. It's been mostly who is this person hanging out with and dating and talking about differently and all that. And then the signaling is actually a really interesting thing when you look on Zoom and how you place your pronouns, because while there may be some folks who think it's performative, I actually do think it is helpful for others to see that, who may or may not be in a place that they are able to do that. So at the end of the day, I think what I've learned from my offspring, young Y to Gen Zers, is that the rigidity and kind of absolutism that I think other older generations have around things, and the binary thinking we have and can only be comfortable if we know what those binaries are,
Mhm.
mine do not have. Like, if you decide you're going to use these pronouns, well, then you use these. And well, they're like, well, and it shifts and changes, and
Mhm.
it's not their job to make me feel comfortable and my ability to roll with that. It really is my job whether it's generationally, culturally, whatever it is, to kind of, again, sorry, like just the very simple thing, following their lead. And so that's what we've done as parents. We've, I will say in parts of our conversations, there's some feelings of loss, and there's some like shifting of identity, and questions that we have that it's not up to my kids to answer, about what do we do with memories and what do we do with these things and all of that. And it's much more intense for us than it is for my children. They're like, well, just do this. And I'm like, okay. So I think that part of it is that following the lead piece is almost taking the perceived intensity away unless it actually is shown. And I think that's again, not all young people are like, youth generation is not a monolith, but in many ways it's not as, for some, as intense of a shift than it is for those of us that this was not what we grew up with, in particular. So I'll leave you with there. Again, I think Sarah and I really hope that you'll ask some questions that you feel comfortable asking and we're being recorded, and then we can also, and then hopefully we can respond in some helpful ways. So I don't know, Sarah, if you want to respond to that, or if we want to just open it up now, whatever is the people's pleasure.
Yeah, so someone sent me a question, and so let's start there. We have been throwing around terms, Bruce and I, partly because we exist in this world, right? And we talk with youth a lot, and so we're just like, woo, non-binary, throwing around things. So just to take a bit of a pause, and I'm gonna drop again a more. This is not a commercial for More Light, but it is. It's a More Light link. Their resource page is exceptional. I tell people that all the time. And so this particular one that I'm dropping right now is a document with terminology. And so it's just a handy resource to have. There are other lists like this. It's not the only list in the world. But earlier when I said that I'm queer and cisgender, so just to break that down a little bit, so cis being, my gender identity matches the sex I was assigned at birth. So that might be a term that people are unfamiliar with. Also, queer is, I have had the experience of talking with people in older generations who are really taken aback by that. I had a conversation literally yesterday where someone was visibly just jarred every time I would say it, because it's a reclaimed derogatory slur. And so I had this conversation with folks, usually in older generations than myself, and let them know that that's hard for people. But as Bruce said, I'm not trying to make other do it for their comfort. It's really about my identity and the fullness of my personhood. And so I'm fine walking through that with people, but I've done that a bit. So it does take a little bit of practice in these conversations with people. So I use queer because it's a helpful umbrella term for me. I have different identities in that umbrella, and so that helps me. That's just where I find the best fit. Some people appreciate that, some people don't. Non-binary, you're not adhering to the male-female binaries, right? And so those are socially constructed, and like Bruce said, they evolve and change, especially with Gen Zers and younger. I mean, that evolves. And I personally love when people say I'm she, they, because that is their understanding of self is fluid. Just in that, it's fluid. So I really appreciate when I talk with youth and they say, oh yeah, you can use she, they, I'm good. And as Bruce said, I am, high achiever, 100%. So I'm like, what do you want to be called? I'm going to change all the things. And as a youth worker, I had an instance where somebody, I heard that their name had changed, and I went into the system and immediately changed it. I was like, they will not be dead named on my time. I'm changing this right now. Now, I made sure somebody else trusted, knew that note, right? But also, I'm like, well, but it's in the system. I don't what. So right, it's that back and forth as church where we want to meet people where they are, but so much of this has not been practiced for so many decades, and so now we're at this place where we're learning as we go and following the lead of the young people. So I hope that's helpful, that those terms, in general, the MLP resource page is something I use all the time. Another resource that, I can get to it here in a little bit. Let's open it up, Bruce, and let's see what questions people have.
Any questions you have for Bruce and Sarah?
All right. We'll just keep talking, and then people.
I'm glad to see we're still so inspiring to the world there, Sarah. Well done, us. It's just
we answered everything.
Yeah. I was gonna jump into to add one piece about. I do think it is important to be intense and intentional about the signaling. That I think as your communities, I think I grew up in a church that we kind of said you learn how awesome we are by osmosis. And I think that's where a lot of denominationally, and a lot of churches are kind of like, we shouldn't have to do all these things because people should just know. And I don't know if they'd say that specifically, but I think there is this sense. And so, why do we? I think, why do we need to include um, different, rainbow flag imagery? And I would say, you begin to look at the way that that has even expanded signals to folks where you are, um, how you we so for instance, the congregation I was serving before, we asked everybody on Zoom every Sunday and our name badges in the sanctuary to put their pronouns down. And it took a while for that, and we had to do it for months and months and months, before you had 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds maybe didn't even understand why, but they felt like we eventually, like, it was important to do so. That was a way that we welcomed people into the space. And I think it became normative. So to really be intentional about that, so that we're not just responding out of a reactive nature of, a young family walks in, it's like, oh no, we need to do a church school now. Like, I think part of it is let's prepare ahead of time so that folks are welcomed and don't feel like they have to be the catalyst for every change that happens. And so I think that, while it can, I think that intentionality and intensity of reaction it isn't always bad. I think we can be proactive about it so that, get into your CRMs, your databases, or your churches, and make sure there's a pronoun section that you can change so that when you're inviting people into, whether it's membership or just participation, that one of the questions that is asked is, what are your pronouns?
Right.
And I think those kinds of things ahead of time help to, one, decide whether you really are a community that is integrally I don't know what the word is, deeply committed to this work,
Right.
or if it is going to be a little more performative or reactionary, which I think most of our places, well intentioned, probably are.
Right. Right. Erica, I saw your hand first. What's your?
Yeah, can y'all hear me?
Mhm.
I have a question. I'm wearing a hat of a parent of teenagers and in sort of a youth leader type role. Question about how to have conversations with young people and families about sleepovers and overnights when it comes to people sleeping in the same room, or asking them to sleep in separate rooms, or they are asking to sleep in particular rooms. And when I say how to have these conversations, I mean within a family, within a church, how to do that, or any suggestions.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Every time I have been in several of these workshops, I like to always shout out Shelley Donaldson and Alex McNeil because I gleaned a lot of information from them. And it's interesting, Erica, because this question always comes up. It always is one of the first questions. So for me, and I'm totally stealing this from Shelley, so I'm glad that's recorded, is that in lock-ins in particular, she has said, create space between you, right? We're not putting people in gendered rooms necessarily, but make sure there is space between you when we're all crashed out on the church floor, right? And I thought that was really beautiful and simple. And so I did it in a retreat that I was leading with youth. And I used Shelley's words and personalized it. I said, create a Sarah-sized hole where between totally stolen, between you, right? Like if you would like to be in a cuddle puddle, it's not going to be at this retreat. I get it. I get that you love your people, and that's lovely. But at nighttime, we are not going to do that, right? So we're not going to be in a cuddle puddle because that's not the intent of like what we're doing here at this particular moment. Later on, when we're watching movies, like and eating all the Starburst, do it. So, this is kind of the conversation that I've had with people, and I did not split people into gendered rooms. I said, please find spaces, and then this is how I ran it, Erica. So But I put an adult in each of those spaces, right? And so we still abide by your child protection policy. Like none of that is out the window, right? Like obviously you're abiding by your policy, making sure everyone's safe. But really creating spaces that aren't along the binary. And another thing I would say is if you do know that there are youth that are non-binary, I always lean to their comfort as opposed to the comfort of, a cis, like hetero child, right? Like, I mean, obviously we want everyone to be comfortable, but my concern is for the marginalized person in that space. And so those are two things I would say. Bruce, do you have a parent response to that piece?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. First, for everybody that does youth ministry in any form, oh my goodness gracious, I can't imagine trying to navigate that world right now. So amazing, amazing, amazing. So it's interesting. I think context certainly matters, and I don't want to totally stereotype living in California and living in the San Francisco Bay Area, but that does lend itself towards a different norm when it comes to parenting, sleepovers, all those kinds. Just the reality. I mean, my kids grew up. Their high school had multiple folks who identified as gender fluid or non-binary, and so this was not like this is just their world. In the places again that we intentionally place them in the communities that surrounded them. So for us, ours was always basically when you're an adult, you can do anything you want, and as soon as you wait to college, really, we have no control anyway. And so we were very much, and also we were very. I don't know if it's fortunate is the right idea, but there weren't a lot of requests for sleepovers and that kind of thing for the growing up in our household. But when it did happen, we did have open door policies and that kind of general things without being, again, it wasn't all things go, but it was you're sharing a space now with the rest of us. And so, you keep your doors open and that kind of thing. But we didn't really have to deal with, I'm trying to think if we had to ever kind of think through anything that we felt was problematic in any way. And I don't think we did. And even in high school, there were relationships with multiple gender perspectives. So, no, I don't have a great answer for you, Erica. Apologies for that. Yeah, there you go. There is a non-answer, hopefully a good answer. Mary Todd, I love seeing all my old friends on this. So, and I now think we are old. So, good to see you, Mary Todd.
Hey, Bruce, it's really good. I really appreciate y'all doing this webinar. My question is, I heard the More Light as a resource. What resources would you recommend for parents who are just now learning about their child's preferences and renaming and how to help a congregation that's pretty, I guess, more right than left of the Presbyterian
Sure.
denomination? Like, how can I best help the family, and what resources can I give them, and how can I best help our congregation?
Sure. Mary Todd, I love this question too. And I will tell you, I have had this conversation. You were not the only person to ask me this question. So, but I think, and I would love to hear what, resources Bruce has too. I'm going to highlight a couple and I'll drop them in the chat. One is the Gender Unicorn has been very successful in my conversations with people. And so you might say to yourself, what's a gender unicorn? Or you might say, oh yeah, I totally have like all of those copied. So that's the Gender Unicorn for you. There is there's an older model of the genderbread person. I learned about the gender unicorn again from Alex McNeil because, in his words, it was more whimsical. But I have found that people really appreciate it, and it gives you spectrums about attraction, gender identity, sexuality. And the beautiful part about that spectrum is that you can really find your place along it, right? So I think that's been really helpful in giving people that resource to say, think of it like dismantling the binary has been one of, I think, the biggest challenges in conversations I've had with people. So if you think about it on a spectrum, I think that's been a helpful resource. Another one that it's just a beautiful book, and it has a Mary Todd. It has that one is the Queerfully and Wonderfully Made book. It does have an affirming congregational partner book to it. I think both are excellent, but for church workers, I think having both is nice, and having the Queerfully and Wonderfully Made on hand. And there's some other great resources out there, but just to pull those two forward. As far as talking with the congregation, I have noticed that because I signal and I have all these conversations with people and I've led workshops at churches, and as Bruce was saying, creating that fertile ground for welcome without being prompted by a particular person, right? I have had a lot of people come to me directly. I got emails from folks saying, okay, this person says this is their name, but I knew them as this name. How do I navigate that? And that has been a lot of personal conversation. Workshops are helpful and classes are helpful, and all of that is good in a congregation. But I have found that making myself available for that is a small shift, right? And it may not shift the whole system because it's a systemic and an individual conversation. That's what makes part of this so tricky. So systemically, like Bruce was talking about, having a place for people to put their pronouns in, being able to share welcome and affirmation a lot. I will say that something that's interesting to me is once you start looking at things, it's like the Matrix with the heteronormative lens. If you look at things and say, like, is that heteronormative? There's a lot that is heteronormative in our churches. And CRMs or databases is one of them, right? And so once you start looking at things, you can say, like, why does that sign look like that? Why bathrooms are another conversation, right? Like, where are we having family bathrooms or non-binary bathroom spaces? What are we sharing with people if we were to have a youth and their queer friend walk into the congregation? When they walk in, how are they seeing that? So those are a couple of things. We can, give me a call, Mary Todd. We can talk more about it, but like, I'm happy to chat with you. But is that helpful a little bit? Okay.
Yeah, so I think those are to echo that a little bit. Our folks, I think there's those two streams. One is personal contact, and I've always said to folks, if you have parents who need to process this and have it not be their child's, they can always come to me. I mean, I don't put that out for other things. Like, and for some folks, I'm the resident Filipino in their lives, and so that may be the thing that they might send people to. But for this, I think that is really important for parents to be able to process this, especially with, especially parents who are really sensitive about how their reaction could do harm. And so, but knowing there may be things that come out in that processing that they need to have come out to connect them with the parent. And my guess is that they will know who those folks are in their communities. But if you are a parent like I am that is open to that, how you make yourself known subtly and intentionally is really important. So I think figuring out a way to do that. And then I think MLP is actually this, again, it's not a commercial, but one of the things that we do is I will about 5 or 6 times a year come in and Zoom in with the congregation that is having these conversations, and I bring, as a pastor and worship leader and those kinds of things, how do we begin to have this be more than just the flag and the statement, but actually have it in the meaningful nature of worship and those pieces that Sarah's looked it up. You start to really see how we use language and things in all aspects of worship and building and all that. So, and then the last thing I would say is our folks still find PFLAG pretty helpful, actually. If there's a PFLAG chapter in your area, my guess is there is everywhere. Has continued to evolve as experiences and terminology have become more open. That is still a really helpful space to go. So I think that there's everything from the gamut from individual down to very kind of tried and true organizational support and processing groups like PFLAG, I think are really important. I've never actually have not heard of a negative experience of somebody going to PFLAG and be like they were terrible. Like it just that has not happened. So my guess is that out of their foundations, they have continued to grow and evolve and shift in their own support that they offer to folks.
That's a great point. Yeah, they've been doing this a bit. There's a great question, Bruce, if you want to tackle.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is thank you, Courtney, for lifting that up. So I always kind of I think we often lead with a lens of negativity, and I think I think it's social norms, right? As opposed to the unique and what is the what are the realities. So before I get to the question, Courtney, but one of the big questions right now is like trans folks in sports. And there was a great article just written, I think it was The Atlantic, about how if you can always find the big fear is that men are going to step into women's sports and dominate. And the reality is that just doesn't happen. And that that's not that, but that's the thing that we're trying to that the society and certain parts of society are trying to focus on, as opposed to this article is talking about this amazing expression of self that some folks are finding room to do and to figure out, and what does that mean? So I think according to the question that you lift up now there, I think part of it is if there is room for somebody who is feeling like they're comfortable enough to express themselves, I think that's the one, like there's some space here that's been happening. Now, how do you create that space where you can continue to have conversations so that, in any relationships, wise choices are made, not to be patronized or condescending about somebody and saying, well, this is just a phase that folks are going through, or those kind of things. Because as I've learned, right, there's one person's phase is one person's fluid nature of who they are, right? So, I mean, I think part of it is it's not a negative. It's just this road that we have created space now that folks are being free to travel. Again, I think when you begin to get into conversations about medical procedures, hormones, all those kinds of things, I think that becomes a much more delicate conversation with a child or parents or all of that, with all the people involved. But for kind of moving through the world, I think the positive is like there's some space here. And so how do you develop a good enough relationship where you can have even difficult conversations or questions with a young person? And then, I think ultimately, as a parent, and I've always thought about, what does this do to our relationship? What does this do to our long-term connections? What's the worth of the question or thing I'm about to say? We had one of our children made a decision in life, and my siblings said to me, well, you should just tell them they can't do this. And I'm like, well, I could. That's one choice. Now, if it was life-threatening and think like I was willing to risk our relationship to save physical life, then maybe. But in this case, I was like, I'm not great with what the decision was, but I'm not willing to risk this relationship by placing some mandate that is, one, unenforceable, and two, just creates this thing that we're going to have to get over later. I'm going to express as well as I can my yearnings for our relationship, my opinions about what's happening, and hopefully that is enough to keep us in relationship. So I would say you're trying to find that sweet spot of, is a relationship good enough where you can have these questions and conversations? What do you want the ramifications to be, and what you're willing to do? What are the risks involved? And then to lead with positive intent or positive lens, to say, like, if there's some space that's been created where somebody is like, I'm freely expressing this thing that I'm experiencing, feeling about who I am, which I think is great.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Somebody has sent me a question about helping either your youth or who might have friends who are queer. I think that is, and it's similar to what Bruce is saying, right? There's relationship, and there's also the opportunity. If you're the parent and you think, this friend, how will they know if they could talk to me? Right? How can you be a welcome and affirming presence without greeting them, at the door and saying, I'm welcoming, right? Like you don't want to be that person. But that's sometimes sometimes you want to be very well intentioned. I'm welcoming, I'm affirming, and I want you to know, right? You don't have to paint your kitchen rainbow, but I think that you can say to them, you can have conversations with that child, that child's friend, whatever it is, in a space that they know that you were that person. So for instance, like with the youth that I've worked with, I had youth who did not identify as non-binary, but they were like, hey, so I think my friend who isn't churchy, that's always the comment. They're not churchy, but they are using they, them. And do you have those extra pronoun buttons? And I had gotten an extra stash, and I said, sure. And I just had them in the youth space, right? I don't know where that button went. I don't need to know where that button went. But I find that the youth are having these conversations in the hallway. I'm not with them, right? I'm not with them between English class and math. So how can I help equip them in those spaces in the hallway or at lunch? So that they might say, in my case, hey, Sarah has talked with us about this and this, and that you're, about God and our faith and being beloved children. And, maybe they have a little bit of language, and then maybe you become that extra affirming adult in their lives. Because it's not overstating it to say that those adults are life-saving in this conversation. I want to highlight that Trevor Project had a beautiful study about it. And there are people who they might see you as the extra adult, not their parental units, right? But that extra adult that they could talk to. And y'all, it's life-saving. It just is. I mean, I don't want to make it overly dramatic, but it is. And so what if you were that extra adult and then you could share that with other adults? How beautiful would that be to have a tapestry of affirming adults to help these young people along their journey of identity and exploration? So I just wanted to highlight that in any way you could say, hey, I'm that person. I know you're friends with my kid. I'm not your parent, but I hope that helps too.
Yeah, I think part of it is, like in anything, if you try too hard, it's not helpful. But at the same time, I'd rather have people try too hard than not at all.
Right.
But at the same, I do think that if your young person in your world has brought somebody who may be thinking, struggling, figuring this out, like you've already been identified as a safe space, and so I think
Right.
that in itself is,
Good point.
and I think I want to, Sarah just brought up, I do think differently than other questions the church has to answer, that this is about people's lives. I mean, there are theologies and gospels out there being preached that we know lead to people dying by suicide and emotional, physical violence perpetrated upon them. And I think that this is not simply again a performative thing we do, but that churches, I think, have to make some real choices about who they are deciding to intentionally welcome and create space for. And in today's climate, not making a choice is a choice, and that is, I think, um, uh, again, Presbyterians aren't ones to look at other denominations and critique, and it took us a long time to get to where we are constitutionally. So I think if your church or community is not outwardly affirming, but you within that community are working towards that, that's awesome. If you're in a community that is not open and affirming and nobody's doing any work towards that, I think that is a continuation of a sinful space to be in, because I think it does signal to people around you that we abdicate, or we're abdicating that space, and in many ways are reinforcing a gospel that is being preached by many who will tell my children that they do not, their personhood is not valued, or so. So I think that is important it's a heavy place to be, but I actually do think this is about lives, and so we need to either be on a journey towards something, and because there are forces on other places that do not value those lives, and I want to be on the side and part of a church that takes those lives seriously, no matter where we may be personally, denominationally, but that folks feel life-giving space when they interact with us.
Bruce and Sarah, what about our young people who just don't know the words to say to friends? What are some of those things as parents? Like, how do we help our young people know what to say instead of just ignoring them at school or ignoring the issue?
I mean, what's interesting is I have encountered young people who teach me so much, right? And so I often am taught by them. I will say, I think it's an adolescence is a amazing time, right? So, sorry, Julie. Right. So the young people do know better than us, in my opinion. I like to say, I've had some youth say, like, this is just not my thing, right? Because I talk about it a lot. And so youth will come up to me and they'll say, we're just going to love everybody. And I'm like, that's great. I love that we love everybody, and I'm in it. But I also am thinking about those people who don't know particularly that they're loved, and how can we be explicit about the implicit. And I think that it's helpful to say, like, we're going to mess up. I may get this wrong, but I'm going to try really hard. And one of those conversations can just be about dating, right? And adolescence. It often is, you're having these conversations about somebody that you're interested in, and you may mess up the word. And it's okay if you mess up the word about but just ask your friend, like, oh, are you feeling like you might want to date this person? You like this person? Like that can help just get that conversation started. There are people that are asexual, and there are people on that spectrum where romantic relationships look different for them. But I think it's in just having conversation like you do in adolescence with each other that helps. Well, I don't know that I'm giving you like a non-answer answer, but I think it's really just in those personal conversations. It really is. And then giving them the space to say, like, again, the gender unicorn has really opened up a lot of conversation where I know that teenagers were like, this is a helpful, useful resource for me and not just my parent, right? To talk about where you are in the spectrum of like sexuality and romantic attraction, if that helps. I don't know. What would you say, Bruce?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I mean, part of it is, right, as we're navigating this and helping our young people to navigate, I kind of feel like it's how do we help our young people navigate social media, right? Or how do we know, like, all of the things that we didn't grow up with, or many of us didn't grow up with, some of you did maybe, but what does it mean for us to be nuanced in that, continue about through everything, and again, it's acknowledging that you're going to make mistakes, but we return after those mistakes to kind of repair that and apologize, whatever we need to do. But so I would add two things. One is always be aware of your reaction to things, because I think sometimes that is the biggest signaler, both in a positive and negative way. And one way that I've always thought about that is every reaction we have to something signals are what we're thinking about something. So we had a college person one time tell us that as soon as your kid mentions a school, do not react, because then you've set the bar for what you think is a good school or a bad school. Like what you think is, and so if they say this and you're like, oh, well, okay, but what about these? Or or you're not going to get into that, or whatever it is, you've kind of set that bar. So I think noticing your reactions is one thing important. The other part that I think is important is that, and this goes congregationally, and when I talk with the young people in my life, I want to, when we talk about all are welcome and trying to have a welcoming lens into the world and way to move through the world, I always want to, it's like all beliefs are welcome. Like you can believe a lot of things, but not all behaviors are. And so figuring out where those lines are for any congregation or how you move through the world, I think is really important. That comes to the, somebody asked a question in there about congregations, about who is welcoming or not. I'm very clear that, that believe what you want. Like we're not a belief police, but if your behavior leads towards violence,
Right.
or trauma or pain, that is not okay. And we do that in many areas in the church where we say this is not an okay behavior. We need to think about that when it comes to LGBTQIA young people and people in our congregations. Like you can believe whatever, you can believe that they shouldn't be welcome, but our behavior is not going to load on to this kind of anti-trans, anti-LGBTQIA mentality that has infiltrated our world. So I think that's a thing. And as a young people who move through the world, believe what you want, struggle what you want, but how we behave and treat people as they move through school and all those kind of things, I think is a delineation that I think is important for us all to make sure we mark, so that we're not feeling like we're confined to not think and not struggle, but ultimately how we behave as we move out of that, I think is most important.
How can we do less harm? Right.
Yes.
Thank you, Bruce and Sarah.
Which leads to good stuff.
Thank you so much. This has been very, very helpful. We really appreciate you. Thank you for being here with us. Let's thank Bruce and Sarah.
Thank you.